Let's set the scene for a moment. Imagine sitting in your living room with your family. The radio is on, playing a lovely classical number, while you and your siblings are reading. Suddenly, the music stops, and the radio announcer describes in detail an alien invasion outside of New Jersey. You listen in shock as the announcer says, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed," followed by the shouts of bystanders as they watch the alien life form appear from a spaceship. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, this is a joke. Aliens never invaded New Jersey. But to the audience listening to the War of the Worlds broadcast the night before Halloween in 1938, the terror was certainly real. This is the true story of a hoax that was never meant to be a hoax. This is the story of the War of the Worlds broadcast.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. In this episode, we're heading back to a time when televisions didn't exist in everyone's homes. Instead of turning on the latest show, families would sit around the radio and listen to the news and other programs. Because nobody could actually see what was happening, it created an opportunity for an elaborate hoax, one that we still talk about today. This is a story about the way we learn about information and an important reminder that you can't always believe everything you hear. You still have to go out and do your own research to fully understand a topic. It's also a fun story about adventure, aliens, and family life in the 1930s. So, let's get into it.
The War of the Worlds broadcast took the world by storm and caused panic across America. But before we get into why and how this broadcast was able to accomplish what it did, we first have to understand science fiction. Science fiction, or sci-fi for short, is storytelling that is based on future scientific technological advances or major social and environmental changes. It is a way to imagine what the future might be like if deep space travel was possible, or if the secrets of time travel were suddenly discovered. While the basic points of science fiction are just that, fiction, it is important to have a level of truth and reality to it as well. Hard sci-fi is inspired by natural sciences like biology and chemistry, while soft sci-fi focuses more on psychology and how people think and react in certain situations. And while science fiction is fairly new as subject or theme, it has actually been around for quite some time. There are elements of science fiction in the 8th century tales Arabian Nights, and even Jonathan Swift's book Gulliver's Travels. But many literary experts believe Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein to be the first true work of science fiction. And remember, kids, Frankenstein is the name of the doctor in the story, not the monster. The golden age of science fiction really began around the time of the War of the Worlds broadcast, right when sci-fi was becoming popular to a wider audience. And it was because of this growing popularity that the folks at the Mercury Theater on the Air saw an opportunity to entertain their audience. The Mercury Theater on the Air was a company that produced a 1-hour radio program that ran on Sunday nights and performed famous works like Dracula and Treasure Island. Originally scheduled to run for 9 weeks, the radio network extended the program, and while the production was loved by critics, it had really low ratings. Another popular program ran at the same time, making it difficult for the Mercury Theater to get a wider audience when families were busy listening to a popular variety show. But things were about to change. Mercury Theater's founder, Orson Welles, had an idea to base one of the upcoming shows on H.G. Wells' novel, War of the Worlds. Orson Welles, not to be confused with H.G. Wells, thought it would be fun to make the show sound like a news broadcast that was announcing the invasion of aliens from the planet Mars. Orson Welles would say later in an interview, I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening, and would be broadcast in such a dramatized form as to appear to be a real event taking place at that time, rather than a mere radio play. The producers loved Orson's idea, and before long, a script was written and actors began rehearsing lines. On October 30th, 1938, the Mercury Theater aired the performance, starting with the usual introduction.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
Next, Orson Welles is introduced and gives an introduction that is followed by music.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own.
To the normal person, the production seemed normal, if not a little boring. Dance music starts playing, but then the radio announcer apologizes for the interruption to let the audience know that he just received a special bulletin that small explosions have been seen on the planet Mars.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity.
The announcer promises more news later on, and a new song is then blasted through the radio. So, the show continues on. As the show progresses, the announcer, Mr. Phillips, introduces a scientist and interviews the man about the explosions on Mars. The actor playing the scientist does a wonderful job downplaying the explosions and assures the audience that aliens are not real and that Mars is far, far away.
We take you now to Princeton, New Jersey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Carl Phillips speaking to you from the observatory at Princeton. Professor, may I begin our questions?
Any time, Mr. Phillips.
Professor, would you please tell our radio audience exactly what you see as you observe the planet Mars through your telescope?
Nothing unusual at the moment, Mr. Phillips. A red disk swimming in a blue sea. Transverse stripes across the disk.
Then you're quite convinced, as a scientist, that living intelligence as we know it does not exist on Mars?
I should say the chances against it are 1,000 to 1.
And yet, how do you account for these gas eruptions occurring on the surface of the planet at regular intervals?
Phillips, I cannot account for it.
By the way, Professor, for the benefit of our listeners, how far is Mars from the Earth?
Approximately 40 million miles.
Well, that seems a safe enough distance.
Thank you.
Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Someone has just handed Professor Pearson a message. While he reads it, let me remind you that we are speaking to you from the observatory in Princeton, New Jersey, where we are interviewing the world-famous astronomer, Professor Pearson. One moment, please. Professor
At this
Pearson
point,
has passed me a
Mr.
message
Phillips
which he has just
announces that
received.
the scientist
Professor, may
has
I
just
read the
received
message to
word
the listening audience?
of a small
Certainly.
earthquake outside of Princeton, New Jersey, that needs to be investigated. So, like it is the most logical thing to do, Mr. Phillips and the scientist leave the show to investigate while another announcer takes over the program.
Probably a meteorite of unusual size, and its arrival at this particular time is merely a coincidence. However, we shall conduct a search as soon as daylight permits.
Thank you, Professor.
Up until this point, there isn't much drama in the show. The conversation between Mr. Phillips and the scientist has been normal and informative. The conversation between the two men is calm, the audience has nothing to worry about, but all that is about to change.
Hi, young historians. Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Cheng Yi Sao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.com honesthistory.co and use code AnyTimeNow for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code AnyTimeNow. Okay, let's get back to the story.
It is important to remember that science fiction was just starting to become popular in 1938. And even with its increase in popularity, it is reasonable to assume that many of the listeners of the program did not have experience with the science fiction genre, even though H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds novel had been in constant publication since 1898. The original story, first published in 1869 by Pearson's Magazine in the UK and Cosmopolitan in the US, published H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds serially, meaning small excerpts were published with each issue of the magazine. Wells' story of an alien invasion to London was a hit, and later published as a book and translated into several languages. H.G. Wells was the first person to describe an attack by aliens from Mars, and is responsible for coining the term Martian in his book. Wells describes how society responds to the Martian attack, and how social order slowly collapses as the Martians war against humans. Wells describes the aliens in his book as octopus-like creatures with 2 eyes and a V-shaped mouth. The creatures appear to have no bones and use tall fighting machines that resemble water towers and use laser guns and black smoke to attack humans on Earth. The image of these alien creatures in War of the Worlds is terrifying, but to listen to a performance of the encounters with these creatures, as if it was real, has the ability to send a shiver down a person's spine to this day. When Mr. Phillips and the scientists reach Princeton, New Jersey, they see that the earthquake was caused by a meteor hitting the Earth. But when they look more closely, they see something else entirely.
It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. We have dispatched a special mobile unit to the scene, and we'll have our commentator, Carl Phillips, give you a word picture of the scene as soon as he can reach there from Princeton.
Mr. Phillips describes a thing half buried in a vast pit. The surrounding trees are broken into splinters, having been struck by the object on impact. The object in the pit doesn't look like a meteor, or at least any kind of meteor Mr. Phillips has ever seen. He describes it as a huge cylinder with a metal sheath that is yellowish white in color and an odd scraping sound that can be heard coming from the object. Mr. Phillips turned to the scientist for an explanation.
We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Professor Pearson.
Yes, Mr. Brooks.
Can you tell us the meaning of that scraping noise inside the thing?
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see its cylindrical
Just a minute.
shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and the thing must be hollow.
He's moving! Keep back there! Keep back there! Keep those men back! Keep back there! Keep those idiots back!
The terror in the voices of the actors seems real, so real that if someone missed the introduction of the radio program, they wouldn't have any reason to believe that the action in the scene wasn't indeed really happening. The show continues as the action quickly escalates.
Take off! The top's loose! Look out there! Stand back!
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone's calling someone or something. I can see turning out of that black hole 2 luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Oh, yeah, I can see the thing's body. Now it's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, Ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips. It seemed to quiver and pulsate, and the monster or whatever it is can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now, and the crowd falls back. They've seen plenty. The most extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. And, well, I'll pull this microphone with me as I talk. I'll have to stop the description until I can take a new position. Hold on, will you please? I'll be right back in a minute.
Minutes later, Mr. Phillips returns, but the chaos continues as screams can be heard in the background as the Martians begin their assault. The program continues with fake interviews with military personnel, eyewitnesses, and people arming themselves to fight off their new alien foe.
What anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles are spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
By the time the program ends, the listeners are struck with a sense of terror. Is this real? Are aliens attacking Earth? Panic ensues as people call local police and news stations looking for answers. By the next morning, October 31st, Orson Welles had created a panic. While modern retellings have exaggerated the panic that followed the broadcast, there was, without a doubt, a sense of dread that struck the heart of the audience that tuned in to the Mercury Theater's presentation. During a press conference the next day, reporters asked Welles if he had intended to trick audiences into believing it was really an alien attack. Welles denied any intention to scare his audience, though, to this day, many do not take him at his word. In later years, Welles admitted that while he didn't want to fool everyone, he had hoped to trick some of his audience to teach them a lesson that they shouldn't believe everything they hear, a lesson that is still being taught today. Looking back on that fateful night, it's clear to see the impact the broadcast had on the science fiction community. The year 1938 was just the start of what will become one of the greatest eras of science fiction writing and would prepare the world for the writings from authors like Frank Herbert, Isaac Asimov, Octavia Butler, and James Tiptree Jr., whose real name was Alice Bradley Sheldon. The effect the War of the Worlds broadcast had on popular culture is one that lives on to this day. In fact, some claim that the term fake news came from that fateful night in October. And while a modern audience could possibly still fall for such a stunt, the lesson Welles wanted to impart to his audience remains the same. You can't always believe everything you hear.
Welcome back. We'd like to give a special thanks to Patton Oswalt for hosting this episode and bringing this amazing story to life. Can you imagine what it must have been like to hear the War of the Worlds broadcast on the radio with your family? Would you have been tricked into believing the Earth was under attack? Now, as we often talk about on this show, it's important to remember that new facts about history are often being uncovered. This story is no different. For many, many years, people believed that the War of the Worlds broadcast caused a mass panic. Now, historians believe that although many people may have been fooled by the radio broadcast, the idea of mass panic was actually created by newspapers hoping to turn people against the radio. This is just another example of why it's so important to always do your own research. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about space, check out issue 5 of Honest History magazine and learn all about the space race and the astronauts behind our mission to the moon. See you all next time! This episode was hosted by Patton Oswalt and written by Brooke Knight. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.